let's rip into the Outsider's Guide to Inner City Poverty. Now, beggars were once described as the aristocracy of the underworld. Beggars, the poor, the homeless, people down on their luck, drug addicts, the dispossessed, alcoholics have always been part, going back to Roman times, part of inner city, built-up, congested lifestyles. And in inner cities, you see this dreadful disconnect or disparity between the wealthiest citizens and the poorest. So let's talk about it now with Rita Panahi, with James Morrow and myself. Let's talk about inner city poverty. James, I'll kick off with you. Just give us a little bit of a rundown on, I guess, the history of inner city poverty.
Well, I mean, you know, as the Lord said, the poor are always with us, and we've always had, as long as there's been cities, as long as there's been people, there's been poverty. And I think one of the interesting things that you can talk about it with this issue is how this is something that has been with society since ancient times, and that every society has to work out a way to deal with and help and support people who are down on their luck, either temporarily or just basically long-term. How does society view them? How does society deal with them? I would argue that how we deal with people like this is one of the real markers of a civilization.
I agree with you. And Rita, for example, if we looked at Dickensian London as the classic example, made famous obviously in all of Dickens's work, but so many others, Victorian England was a time of great prosperity and great wealth, and yet you had the poor in the streets. At that point in time, and I guess a lot of the union movements and a lot of left-wing thinking grew out of that period, that Victorian era. But what we saw was a lot of charities established, both religious ones and non-religious ones, but particularly religious ones, set up to help the people around them in the streets and in the back alleys. We've kind of replaced that today, I guess, with the welfare state. But have we really got any further? I was horrified when I was recently in Brighton to see how many homeless were out on the streets, and almost looked Dickensian.
Oh, well, you're talking about Brighton in the UK,
yes,
not the Brightons in Australia. Yeah, you're right. We do now have that welfare safety net, but we've also got the charities, and I know certainly in Melbourne CBD there are very active charities who provide free food, opportunity for people to have their clothes laundered and all sorts of other care to help them. And that's why they say do not ever give to beggars. In fact, in most places it's a crime to give money to a beggar, because they encourage you to give that money to a charity that supports homeless people or people who are begging, rather than give it directly to the person. Because if they have a substance issue problem, then that money is probably going to be spent on drugs or alcohol, as opposed to helping them get a roof over their head and a meal in their stomach. So it really is a complex issue, and when you've got it around you, when you see it, it's all good and well to be told don't give to beggars, you're only perpetuating the problem, you're making it worse. But when you see someone who seems to be desperate and hard done by, you want to help. So I know it's not an easy issue for people, and in the CBDs of our major cities, it's becoming a real problem. The homelessness and the begging. Often they go hand in hand, but not always. And then you've got the issue of the so-called professional beggars, and that is certainly a reality. It's not some figment of people's imagination. There's been arrests in Melbourne over the years for that sort of behaviour, and they seem to be a lot more predatory. So they're not your typical beggars who you might see sitting there with an empty cup asking for people to make donations. They approach you and they're very aggressive in the manner in which they seek money, and they intimidate people, often tourists, to give them money.
And isn't this part of the problem, James, that I think people, many people now are so confused, as Rita says, because your humane instinct, if you see someone down on their luck, impoverished in some way or other, you want to help, if you can, you want to help out and give them a hand. But, you know, there's all these other voices going on in your head. Well, I don't want to encourage drinking or drug taking or whatever it might be. I don't know about you, James. I've kind of fallen into the thing that if I see somebody who is, and maybe this is a kind of, you know, conservative thought or whatever, I don't know, but if I see someone who's making an effort to do something like play a guitar, or even doesn't matter how badly they are doing their thing for the money, I'm much more inclined to say, yeah, this person is serious, they deserve that chance, than, and again I might be being unfair, than the person just sitting there doing nothing, waiting for the coin to fall in the cup.
Yeah, look, I think probably a lot of people, Rowan, kind of fall into that camp. You know, I grew up in New York. I spent the first 20 years of my life in New York, and I spent that time at a time when New York was really, you know, kind of in a sort of fairly crummy situation. It was pre-Giuliani. I think it's probably a situation that New York is heading back into right now, but that's another story. Anyway, there was a huge number of homeless people, beggars, indigent, on the streets at that time. And, you know, back then, too, you did carry cash. That's another thing. Nobody carries cash anymore. So I've been approached by people who look very, very sympathetic and say, look, I'm sorry, I would love to help you out. I don't have any cash, because, you know, nobody carries cash anymore, especially in the sort of post-COVID world that we live in. But I do remember that, you know, there were ones who were, you know, who were engaging and would attempt to at least have a bit of a shtick or a routine that would always make you reach into your pocket and give them $1 just for the laugh and for the entertainment, and, you know, have a little conversation with the guy. These were always, you know, I think, and I don't know what their full circumstance was, but, you know, again, versus people who just seem to be sitting there expecting money. And, you know, I do recall that, I think it was in Victorian times or maybe later, the British had a law about sturdy beggars, it was called. Sturdy beggars were beggars who were otherwise fit to work. And so if there was, and they made a legal distinction between somebody who was unable to work for whatever reason and those who should be working, and made one a crime and one not. I think that that's actually a pretty good way to be approaching it, because it does, you know, from a legal point of view, say, well, if you can help yourself, do, but if you can't, then it's another category.